A deep silence once forged the very ideas that shattered a continent. This is the story of monastic seclusion, the quiet world where monks retreated from society, and how that isolation sparked explosive reforms that reshaped the medieval era. By the end of this journey, you will understand how solitude can build the intellectual gunpowder for societal revolution. We will uncover why the most disciplined quiet often precedes the loudest upheavals, and how a personal crisis of faith behind cloistered walls could ignite a firestorm across nations. What does true silence make possible in your own life? A heavy wooden gate closes, sealing out the clamor of the medieval world. Inside, a new reality takes hold, governed by the rhythmic chant of prayers and the quiet turning of pages. This radical way of life, monasticism, did not begin in the cold stone of European abbeys, but in the vast, sun-scorched deserts of Egypt and Syria. Here, in the 3rd and 4th centuries, individuals like Saint Anthony felt a profound call to abandon the bustling cities of the Roman Empire. They sought not emptiness, but a different kind of fullness, a direct and undistracted encounter with the divine in the stark solitude of the wilderness. These early desert fathers were the pioneers, testing the limits of human spirit and discipline in their search for spiritual purity. Their extreme asceticism, however, was a difficult path for the many. It required a structure, a framework to make such a demanding life sustainable for communities of believers. This is where a young Italian nobleman named Benedict of Nursia entered the story. Disturbed by the moral decay he saw in 6th century Rome, he too retreated to a cave, but his lasting legacy was not his own solitude. It was the rule he wrote, a comprehensive guide for communal monastic living. At its heart was a simple, powerful Latin phrase, ora et labora, meaning pray and work. This principle wove together the spiritual and the physical into a single, seamless fabric of daily life. The Benedictine rule transformed the hermit's lonely struggle into a disciplined, collective endeavor. Monasteries became self-sufficient worlds behind their walls, with gardens for food, scriptoriums for copying books, and workshops for crafts. This intentional separation from secular society was the entire point. It was a strategic withdrawal, a conscious decision to build a parallel society dedicated to higher pursuits. The chaos of feudal politics, the distractions of commerce, the noise of everyday life, all were left at the gate. Within the cloister, a structured silence reigned. This was not merely the absence of sound, but an active, cultivated atmosphere of focus. It was in this fertile quiet, amid prayerful routine and manual labor, that the mind was freed to ponder, to study, and to question. The seeds of future upheavals were being planted in the most peaceful of gardens, nurtured by a silence so profound it would one day break like thunder. That quiet scratch of a quill on parchment was the sound of civilization being saved. Deep within the monastery walls, in the hushed and hallowed space known as the Scriptorium, monks engaged in a labor of devotion that would change the world. This was no ordinary writing room. It was a crucible of knowledge, a fortress against forgetting. Here, for centuries, the only light often came from a single candle or a high, narrow window, illuminating hands that moved with deliberate care. The rule of silence was absolute, broken only by the necessary, whispered requests for a new ink pot or a fresh sheet of vellum. This was not a place for conversation, but for concentration, a sacred workshop where the primary task was preservation. Can you picture the immense weight of that responsibility? Every line they copied was a thread connecting their turbulent present to a more stable past. They were copying the very books that a dissolving Roman Empire had left behind. the works of philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, the plays of poets, the theories of ancient scientists, and of course, the foundational texts of their own faith. Without their quiet, dedicated work, these voices would have been lost forever, swallowed by the so-called Dark Ages. But these monks were not merely human photocopiers. Their work was deeply intellectual. As they traced each letter, they were also reading, absorbing, and thinking. In the margins of these precious manuscripts, they would often add their own glosses, their own theological and philosophical commentaries. A simple question written in the margin next to a complex passage from Aristotle could spark a debate that would ripple through the monastery for weeks. This process of annotation was the beginning of new ideas, the first stirrings of intellectual challenges that would one day erupt into the open. The Scriptorium, in its profound seclusion, was slowly and methodically building a reservoir of thought. Each meticulously copied manuscript was another measure of intellectual gunpowder carefully packed into the keg, waiting only for a future spark to ignite it. The silence of the cloister was not an end in itself. It was the necessary condition for a great and gathering storm. Yet within that hallowed silence, a vibrant and restless intellectual energy was simmering. The monastic life was far from a static existence of simple prayers and routine chores. It was, in its own secluded way, a hotbed of profound debate and rigorous inquiry. The very walls that kept the world out created a unique pressure cooker for the mind, where deep theological study and complex philosophical questions were not just permitted but actively encouraged. Monks spent countless hours interpreting scripture, not merely accepting its words but wrestling with their meaning. They engaged in logical disputation, a formal method of debate where every point of doctrine was tested and defended through reason. This was a culture where faith was not opposed to understanding but was sought through it. A brilliant example of this is Anselm of Canterbury, an 11th century monk who, from within his monastic cell, developed one of the most famous philosophical arguments in history, the ontological argument for the existence of God. This was not a simple declaration of belief, but a complex logical proof born from the intense, focused contemplation that monastic seclusion made possible. In this environment, the monastery effectively functioned as a university in miniature, a training ground for some of the sharpest minds of the age. It taught them a disciplined method of thinking, a habit of questioning assumptions and building arguments step by logical step. These were the intellectual tools that, once honed behind silent walls, would eventually be turned outward, applied to the wider church and the pressing issues of society. The quiet of the cloister was not an empty quiet. It was the sound of deep, concentrated thought, the necessary internal fermentation of ideas that would one day demand a public hearing. A single monastery in Burgundy became the epicenter of a spiritual revolution. The Abbey of Cluny, founded in the year 910, ignited a movement that would reshape Western monasticism. Its founders were driven by a powerful conviction, a belief that the original vision of Saint Benedict had become clouded by the interference of local nobles and bishops. The Cluniac reform was at its heart, a whisper of change from within the very heart of the secluded life. It was a call to return to a stricter observance of the Benedictine rule, but with a crucial twist: independence. Cluny was placed directly under the protection of the Pope, effectively cutting the strings that feudal lords used to control other religious houses. This freedom from secular control was revolutionary. It allowed the Cluniac monks to focus entirely on their spiritual mission, which they defined as the pursuit of liturgical purity. Their worship became an elaborate, continuous symphony of prayer, a beautiful and complex ritual meant to glorify God without ceasing. This focus required a new kind of organization. The Cluniac movement grew not as a collection of independent abbeys, but as a centralized network, a religious empire with Cluny at its head and all its dependent priories reporting to a single abbot. This structure created a powerful, international institution whose influence stretched across Europe, from Spain to the Holy Roman Empire. The success of the Cluniacs demonstrated something profound. It proved that organized, secluded communities, when freed from local entanglements, could amass incredible spiritual authority and, inevitably, significant economic wealth. They became centers of learning, art, and land management, showing the world that a renewed commitment to the core principles of monastic life could build formidable institutions of immense influence. The quiet, disciplined whisper from Cluny had created a blueprint for power, a model that would soon be challenged by even louder calls for a different kind of change. While the Cluniacs built a spiritual empire, another order was carving out a different path in the stark mountains of France. The Carthusian Charterhouse was a world unto itself, a collection of individual hermitages gathered around a central church. Each monk lived almost entirely within his own small cell, a humble house with a workshop and a small garden, seeing his brothers only for the night office and a single silent meal on most days. This was not a communal life in the Benedictine sense, but a community of hermits representing the absolute pinnacle of monastic withdrawal. Founded by Saint Bruno in the year 1084, the Carthusian order was established on a single, unwavering principle: the pursuit of a purer, more direct connection with the divine through absolute silence and solitude. Their rule was famously strict, demanding a life of prayer, manual labor, and scholarly copying done almost entirely in seclusion. This radical commitment made them a powerful symbol of uncompromising spiritual rigor. While other orders amassed lands and political influence, the Carthusians remained largely free from the wealth and corruption that began to stain the broader church. Their very existence, sustained for centuries, was a living testament that the most extreme form of seclusion was not only possible but spiritually potent. It inspired awe in those who saw them as spiritual athletes, but it also drew criticism from those who questioned the value of such isolation. Ultimately, the silent, disciplined lives of the Carthusian monks served as a constant, unspoken critique. Their stark cells in the mountains stood in quiet judgment of a church hierarchy that was becoming ever more entangled in the power games and material concerns of the world. This was a silence so profound it spoke volumes, a living question mark placed against the status quo. Yet even the quiet judgment of the Carthusians was not the final word. In the year 1098, a new kind of storm began to brew, not in the mountains, but in a swampy, isolated French forest called Cîteaux. Here, a small band of monks made a radical break. They were not seeking a more extreme solitude, but a purer form of the communal life itself, and they believed the great abbey of Cluny had lost its way. These men, who would become the Cistercian order, looked at the elaborate rituals, the vast landholdings, and the political influence of the Cluniacs, and saw a dangerous drift from the original simplicity of Saint Benedict. Their answer was a revolution of radical humility. They rejected the dark, ornate habits of other monks, wearing instead undyed wool that gave them their famous name, the White Monks. They sought out the most remote and difficult lands, places no one else wanted, and with their own hands they drained marshes and cleared forests to build their stark, beautiful abbeys. For the Cistercians, manual labor was not just a practical necessity. It was a sacred act, a core part of their spiritual devotion. They turned their backs on the splendid art and architecture that adorned Cluniac churches, believing such grandeur was a distraction from God. Their own buildings were breathtaking in their stark simplicity, with clean lines and vast, unadorned spaces designed to focus the mind solely on prayer. How could such an austere life spread so quickly? The answer arrived in the form of a single, electrifying man, Bernard of Clairvaux. A powerful orator and a magnetic leader, Bernard joined the Cistercians as a young man and quickly became the order's most passionate evangelist. His fiery sermons and personal charisma drew thousands to the white monk's cause. Under his influence, the order exploded across Europe, from the rainy British Isles to the frontiers of Eastern Europe. The Cistercian Revolution demonstrated a profound truth. Reform did not always require a completely new doctrine. Sometimes, the most explosive change came from a radical return to the basics, a fierce and uncompromising recommitment to the original founding principles. Their success was built on a powerful, magnetic appeal to authenticity. In a world weary of institutional complexity and wealth, the stark purity of the white monks felt like a spiritual lightning strike, proving that a storm of renewal could be whipped up from a simple, powerful desire for a deeper, more meaningful silence. The quiet of the cloister was the sound of a mind sharpening its most powerful tools. While monks prayed and labored, they were also constructing a formidable intellectual arsenal, a system of thought so rigorous it would one day be used to question the very foundations of their world. This was the birth of Scholasticism, a method that placed faith and reason in a dynamic, sometimes tense, partnership. At the heart of this movement was a brilliant and controversial teacher named Peter Abelard. Working in the scholarly settings that evolved from monastic and cathedral schools, Abelard championed a revolutionary technique he called sic et non, which means yes and no. His method was deceptively simple, yet explosive in its implications. He would gather statements from revered church authorities, the fathers and saints whose writings were considered beyond reproach, and he would place them side by side to reveal glaring contradictions. One saint would say one thing about a point of doctrine, and another would appear to say the exact opposite. Abelard did not provide the answers. Instead, he forced his students to grapple with the questions, to use the tools of logic and dialectic to reconcile the irreconcilable. This was not an attack on faith, but an immense act of faith in the power of human reason to illuminate divine truth. Can you sense the shift happening here? The unquestioning acceptance of authority was being gently, methodically replaced by the imperative of critical inquiry. This scholastic method trained an entire generation in logical analysis and disputation. It taught them to build complex arguments step by step, to identify fallacies, and to defend their positions against all comers. These were not just academic exercises. The intellectual tools of dialectics and systematic theology, all forged in the quiet of the study, were providing the logical foundation for challenging established dogmas on their own terms. The monastery and its successor schools were not merely retreats for prayer. They had become the armories where the intellectual weapons for future reformations were being meticulously crafted, sharpened on the whetstone of silent contemplation. These tools of reason, born from a desire to understand God more fully, were destined to be turned upon the institution that represented him on earth. A heavy monastery gate might have kept the world out, but it was not a solid wall. It was a membrane, a semi-permeable barrier through which the needs and sorrows of medieval society constantly flowed. These secluded communities were, paradoxically, vital hubs of social welfare. They were the hospitals for the sick, the inns for the weary traveler, and the granaries for the destitute. Every monastery had an almoner, a monk whose sacred duty was to distribute food, clothing, and sometimes even money to the poor who gathered at their gates. This was not an occasional act of charity, but a structured, daily obligation woven into the very fabric of their rule. Think of a pilgrim, footsore and lost, finding not just a bed for the night but safe passage in a dangerous world. The monastery was his refuge. This constant, structured engagement meant the monks were not blissfully ignorant of life beyond their walls. They heard the confessions of the dying, they saw the desperation in the eyes of peasants begging for bread, and they witnessed firsthand the failures of local lords and even corrupt church officials who neglected their flocks. How could this not affect them? The ideal they pursued within the cloister was one of humility, simplicity, and voluntary poverty, a stark contrast to the opulence they sometimes saw in their own abbots or the distant papal court. This created a deep and growing internal tension. The very men who had renounced personal wealth were part of an institution that was amassing vast estates and political power. The alms they gave to the poor were funded by the rents collected from those same poor working monastery lands. This contradiction did not go unnoticed. It fueled a quiet but persistent critique, both from within the monastic conscience and from outside observers who began to question why the church, as a whole, seemed so rich while Christ had been so poor. The social conscience cultivated at the monastery gate ensured that the coming storm of reform would not be a purely theological debate. It would be a revolt grounded in the real, tangible suffering of the people, a cry for a church that served the many, not just the privileged few. But the walls of the monastery could not contain the hunger for spiritual renewal forever. In the bustling towns of the 13th century, a new kind of storm was gathering, one that would take the energy of reform from the quiet cloister directly into the noisy public square. Two men, Francis of Assisi and Dominic de Guzman, ignited this revolution with a radical new idea. What if the most powerful spiritual life was not lived behind a gate but out among the people? The Franciscans and Dominicans, known as the Mendicant or begging friars, turned the old monastic model on its head. They took vows of absolute poverty, owning nothing, not even the land their monasteries stood on. But instead of withdrawing, they immersed themselves in the growing cities and the new universities. Francis, the son of a wealthy merchant, famously renounced his inheritance to embrace a life of joyous poverty, preaching to birds and lepers alike. His followers lived by begging, not to support a secluded community, but to sustain their mission in the world. Dominic, a learned cleric, saw a different need. He founded his order of preachers to combat heresy through education and persuasive public speaking. The Dominicans became the intellectuals of the streets, mastering theology and logic to debate in town squares and lecture in the halls of learning. The explosive success of these mendicant orders sent a shockwave through the traditional church. They proved that spiritual authority no longer resided solely within the ancient, secluded abbeys. It could be earned by a barefoot friar speaking with heartfelt passion to a crowd of cloth merchants, or by a sharp-minded Dominican winning a debate against a heretic. This was a direct populist challenge. The friars addressed the very social and intellectual needs that the traditional monasteries, for all their charity, observed from a distance. Their presence forced a painful but necessary question. If the path to God was now being so vividly illuminated in the crowded, chaotic streets, what was the continued purpose of the great, silent cloisters? The storm of reform had finally broken free from its seclusion, and it would forever change the sound of faith in Europe. The quiet Scriptorium now had a noisy, ambitious air. That disciplined intellectual culture, so carefully nurtured behind monastery walls, burst into the public square with the rise of the medieval university. In bustling cities like Paris and Bologna, the scholarly methods of the cloister found a thrilling new home. The university was, in essence, the monastery's intellectual spirit institutionalized but set free from the constraints of seclusion. Here, the scholastic method of sic et non was not just a private exercise for monks. It became the very engine of public education. The structured disputation, the rigorous logical analysis perfected in monastic schools, became the standard format for lectures and examinations in these new centers of learning. But the environment was utterly transformed. The hushed reverence of the cloister was replaced by the vibrant, often chaotic, energy of the urban center. Students and masters from every corner of Europe gathered in crowded lecture halls, and passionate debates spilled out into the city streets. This was no longer a sheltered contemplation. It was a public, competitive sport of the mind. Ideas were no longer merely copied and annotated in silence. They were now thrown into a dynamic arena where they had to clash, defend themselves, and evolve or perish. The university became the new crucible where the seeds of thought, so patiently preserved in monastic scriptoria, could finally grow into full-blown intellectual movements. The quiet storm of ideas that had been brewing for centuries was now officially unleashed upon the world, and its thunder would be heard for generations to come. A golden cage was built for the Pope on the banks of the Rhone River. In the year 1309, the seat of papal power was wrenched from its ancient home in Rome and moved to the French city of Avignon. For nearly 70 years, a succession of popes ruled from this splendid but politically compromised palace, a period many contemporaries bitterly called the Babylonian captivity of the Church. This was not a quiet retreat. It was a seismic shift that shattered the illusion of spiritual independence. The papacy now appeared to be a puppet of the French crown, its authority deeply entangled with the interests of a single secular power. From their secluded cells and university chairs, monks and theologians watched this crisis unfold with growing alarm. How could the Vicar of Christ, the spiritual leader of all Europe, be so blatantly subordinate to a worldly king? The very legitimacy of the Church's highest office was now in question. This crisis demanded a response, and the intellectual tools forged in generations of monastic silence were perfectly suited to the task. A Franciscan friar named William of Occam, a master of logic, took up the challenge. Exiled from Avignon for his controversial views, Occam used his razor-sharp mind to dissect the nature of authority itself. He argued that papal power was not absolute. In matters of faith, he declared, even a pope could fall into error, and when that happened, it was the duty of a general council of the Church, representing all the faithful, to correct him. This was a revolutionary idea, shifting ultimate authority from a single, potentially corruptible man to the collective wisdom of the entire Christian community. At the same time, a secular scholar named Marsilius of Padua penned an even more radical critique. Drawing on the same scholastic methods honed in monastic and university settings, Marsilius argued in his work Defensor Passus that the true source of political authority lay not with the Pope, but with the people and their secular ruler. The Church, in his view, should have no coercive power at all, its role being purely spiritual. These were not mere academic theories. They were thunderous critiques launched from the quiet of the study, intellectual bombshells that provided a rigorous framework for defiance. The Avignon papacy, by exposing the Church's deep immersion in politics and finance, had created a crisis of credibility. In response, the long-standing tradition of monastic scholarship, with its emphasis on reason and its relative independence from the papal court, produced the very arguments that would first challenge and then shatter the dream of a single, unquestioned authority in Christendom. The storm was no longer approaching. It had made landfall, and the first structures of power were beginning to tremble. A quiet revolution was now turning inward. While popes built palaces and friars preached in the streets, a profoundly different movement was taking root in the humble towns of the Netherlands. This was the Devotio Moderna, the modern devotion, and its battlefield was not the institution but the human soul. In the late 14th century, as the church hierarchy seemed consumed by power and politics, the followers of this movement asked a simple, radical question. What if true reform did not begin with a new pope or a different rule, but with the quiet, deliberate reformation of a single human heart? Their answer was a spirituality of intense inward focus. They emphasized personal piety and a direct, emotional relationship with God, one that did not rely solely on the external rituals of the church. The most famous expression of this ideal came from the pen of a monk named Thomas à Kempis. His book, The Imitation of Christ, became one of the most influential Christian works ever written, second only to the Bible itself. Its message was stunningly simple and personal. It urged its readers to seek Christ not primarily in grand cathedrals, but within the quiet chambers of their own conscience, to imitate his life of humility and love in their everyday actions. The followers of this path, known as the Brethren of the Common Life, embodied its practical spirit. They were not a formal religious order with solemn vows. They were lay people, priests, and students who chose to live together in communal houses, sharing their possessions and their lives. They supported themselves through the humble, familiar work of the old scriptoria, copying manuscripts, and more importantly, through teaching. Their schools became renowned for a new form of education that blended deep learning with character formation, shaping the minds and spirits of the next generation, including a young boy who would grow up to be Erasmus of Rotterdam. This was the genius of the Devotio Moderna. It proved that the most explosive reforms could begin not with a public manifesto, but with a private shift in consciousness. By making faith a matter of personal experience and intention, it quietly transferred spiritual authority from the institution to the individual. The storm that would soon break over Europe did not need to be whipped up from outside the church. It was being patiently nurtured prayer by prayer in the inner silence of countless ordinary people. A new kind of thunder was rumbling from within the very institutions that had long supported the church. The intellectual weapons forged in monastic and university armories were now being aimed directly at the fortress walls of ecclesiastical power. In England, a fiery Oxford scholar named John Wycliffe launched a blistering attack. Though a secular priest, his ideas found fertile ground and active support within sympathetic monastic circles, who were themselves troubled by the opulence of the church hierarchy. Wycliffe dared to call the vast wealth of the clergy unchristian, arguing that a church drowning in land and political power had strayed far from the example of Christ and the apostles. His most revolutionary act, however, was his insistence that the Word of God should not be locked away in Latin, a language known only to the educated elite. He and his followers, known as Lollards, undertook the perilous task of translating the Bible into English. This was a direct assault on the clerical monopoly over Scripture. Can you grasp the power of that single act? It was an attempt to tear down the wall between the people and their faith, to place the ultimate authority not in the hands of a distant pope, but into the calloused hands of every plowman and merchant who could now hear God's word in their own tongue. This intellectual rebellion did not stay confined to England. It traveled to the heart of Europe, to Bohemia, where a university professor named Jan Hus absorbed Wycliffe's writings and ignited his own firestorm. Preaching from the Bethlehem Chapel in Prague, Hus echoed the call for a return to a simpler, poorer church, free from the corrupting influence of wealth and the sale of indulgences. His powerful sermons, delivered in the Czech vernacular, galvanized a national movement. The church, feeling the threat, summoned him to the Council of Constance. Promised safe passage, he was instead arrested, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake. His martyrdom did not extinguish his ideas, it poured fuel on them, sparking the bloody Hussite wars. These men, Wycliffe and Hus, were not outsiders. They were products of the Church's own intellectual world, trained in the scholastic methods that monasteries had perfected. They used those very tools of logic, disputation, and deep scriptural analysis to build an unassailable case for reform from within. Their voices, rising from academic pulpits and supported by a network of like-minded clerics and monks, proved that the most dangerous storms are not those that arrive from a distant horizon, but those that gather their force in your own backyard. The stage was indeed set, and the continent was holding its breath. A single invention turned whispers into a revolution. Johannes Gutenberg's printing press, perfected around the year 1440, did not create the ideas of reform, but it gave them wings. For centuries, the painstaking labor of the monastic scriptorium had been the primary engine of book production, a slow and deliberate process that kept knowledge contained. The press shattered that model. It was a force multiplier of unimaginable power, taking the intellectual legacy so carefully preserved by monks and launching it into the world at a speed and volume that must have felt supernatural. Think of the difference. Where a single monk might spend a year producing one flawless Bible, a printing shop could now produce hundreds of copies in the same time. This was a complete transformation of the information landscape. The Bible itself, along with theological treatises and sharp critiques of the Church, were no longer rare treasures locked away in libraries. They became objects that could be owned, read, and debated by merchants, artisans, and even farmers. The monastic scriptorium's quiet monopoly over the written word was decisively broken. This was the true democratization of knowledge, the meticulous work of those countless unnamed scribes, the intellectual arguments honed in scholastic debate, the quiet critiques that had circulated in manuscript form for generations were all suddenly amplified. The printing press became the ultimate megaphone, taking the disciplined, reasoned arguments that had fermented in silence and turning them into a deafening public roar that echoed through every city and town. A storm of information had been unleashed, and there was no power on earth that could ever hope to contain it again. A monk's personal terror became the spark that lit the fuse. Martin Luther entered the Augustinian order not in a peaceful search for God, but in sheer, desperate fear. As a young law student, he was caught in a violent thunderstorm, a bolt of lightning striking so close he feared for his life. In that moment of terror, he cried out to Saint Anne, promising to become a monk if he survived. He kept that vow, entering the Erfurt monastery, but he did not find peace behind its walls. Instead, he found a different kind of storm, an internal tempest of spiritual anguish. The disciplined silence of the cloister did not soothe him, it amplified the voice of his own conscience. He was a model friar, following the rules with relentless dedication, fasting, praying, and confessing for hours on end. Yet, no matter how perfectly he performed these acts, he felt no closer to a merciful God. He saw only a divine judge and himself as a hopeless sinner. This was the crisis point, the intense personal struggle that monastic life was designed to contain and resolve. But for Luther, the pressure only grew. The quiet of his cell became a crucible where his fears were refined into a radical new understanding. He immersed himself in the scriptures, particularly the letters of St. Paul, and in that deep, secluded study, a single phrase began to echo in his mind: "The just shall live by faith." His theological breakthrough was not a sudden flash of lightning, but a slow dawn born from years of disciplined study and personal torment. He realized that salvation was not a prize to be earned through human effort, good works, or religious rituals. It was a free gift from God, received through faith alone. This doctrine of justification by faith was the intellectual gunpowder he had been forging in silence. When he nailed his 95 theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg in 1517, he was not trying to start a revolution. He was engaging in a standard academic debate, inviting fellow scholars to dispute the church's sale of indulgences, which promised to reduce time in purgatory for a fee. He saw this practice as a direct contradiction to his hard-won truth that God's grace could not be bought and sold. The theses, however, were not just an academic exercise. They were the public eruption of a private spiritual revolution, the moment the deeply personal crisis of a single monk escaped the cloister and found a tinderbox in a discontented world. The monastic seclusion had given him the space, the discipline, and the intellectual tools to question everything, and the printing press carried his questions to a waiting continent. Luther's journey from a terrified friar to the defiant figurehead of the Protestant Reformation is the ultimate testament to a profound truth, that the most explosive public reforms are often born in the deepest, most silent chambers of the private soul. Irony has a sharp and unforgiving edge. The very institutions that had incubated the tools of reform now became its most visible casualties. As the Protestant movement surged across northern Europe, the ancient monasteries, with their immense wealth and symbolic power, stood as glaring monuments to the old order. Nowhere was this backlash more brutal and systematic than in England, where King Henry VIII, entangled in his own personal and political struggles, unleashed a storm of his own. His break with the Pope in Rome created a new Church of England with the king at its head, and the monasteries were his first and most lucrative target. From 1536 to 1541, a royal commission systematically dismantled nearly 1,000 religious houses. This was the dissolution of the monasteries, a calculated act of state power that erased a millennium of monastic life from the English landscape. The great abbey gates were forced open not by pious reformers, but by royal agents wielding inventory lists and warrants. The quiet chant of prayers was replaced by the sound of lead being stripped from roofs and precious metals being melted down for the royal treasury. The monks and nuns were turned out, their vows nullified, their homes and life's work taken from them. The profound vulnerability of the monastic world was laid bare. Its strategic seclusion, once a source of strength and independence, now made it an easy, isolated target for a centralized state with an army and an insatiable appetite for cash. This was far more than an institutional dismantling. It was a cultural cataclysm. The great libraries, painstakingly built over centuries, were scattered to the winds, their manuscripts lost, burned, or repurposed as scrap paper or book bindings. The traditions of hospitality, charity, and learning that had sustained local communities for generations were abruptly severed. The silent stones of the cloister, which had witnessed so much contemplation, now echoed with the sounds of a very different purpose. Glastonbury Abbey became a quarry, its stones used to build ordinary homes. The majestic Revolx Abbey in Yorkshire was left as a skeletal ruin, a stark silhouette against the sky. The storm of reform, in one of history's cruelest twists, had ultimately destroyed the very environments that had nurtured its earliest intellectual and spiritual sparks. The silence so carefully cultivated for centuries was not merely broken, it was obliterated by the blunt force of the state, leaving a void where a world had once thrived. The ruins of the monasteries were still warm when the Catholic Church began its own profound reckoning. For decades, the institution had seemed paralyzed, unable to stem the tidal wave of Protestant critique. But from within its own ancient structures, a powerful counter-movement began to stir, one that would channel the old monastic spirit into a new, militant form. This was the Counter-Reformation, formally launched at the Council of Trent, a gathering that spanned 18 years from 1545 to 1563. Here, the Church did not simply deny the accusations of corruption and spiritual emptiness. It embarked on a sweeping internal cleanup, reaffirming core doctrines while ruthlessly addressing the abuses that had fueled the rebellion. Central to this project was a dramatic rebirth of religious life, a conscious effort to recapture the fiery dedication of the early Desert Fathers and channel it for a world in crisis. The most spectacular example of this new energy was the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, founded by a Spanish knight named Ignatius of Loyola. His story itself is a powerful allegory for the age. A soldier wounded in battle, his long convalescence was not spent in idle recovery but in a profound internal battle. Reading the lives of the saints instead of the romantic tales of chivalry he preferred, he experienced a conversion that turned his martial fervor toward a new cause. The Jesuits were his new army, and their battlefield was the entire world. They were the shock troops of the Counter-Reformation, a highly educated, mobile, and utterly disciplined order with a radical vow of obedience to the Pope. Their mission was active and worldly, establishing prestigious schools to educate the elite, traveling as missionaries to the Americas and Asia, and debating theologians in the heart of Protestant Europe. Yet this outward-facing, militant energy was born from a deep, structured silence. Ignatius crafted a manual for the soul called the Spiritual Exercises, a rigorous program of meditation and self-examination designed to be undertaken in a retreat of about 30 days. This was not a passive withdrawal. It was a boot camp for the spirit, a disciplined introspection where a person was guided to visualize scenes from the life of Christ, to confront their own sins and attachments, and to ultimately make a choice to order their entire life toward God's service. The exercises took the ancient monastic value of contemplation and gave it a precise, almost military objective: to fortify the individual for action. The old monastic ideals of discipline, scholarship, and seclusion were not abandoned, they were repurposed. The Jesuit became a new kind of monk, one whose cell could be a ship bound for Japan or a classroom in Prague, but whose inner life was steeled in silence. The storm of Protestantism had not destroyed the monastic impulse, it had forced it to evolve, proving that the quiet of contemplation could be harnessed to fuel the most organized and powerful response the old church could muster. The discipline of the cloister became the bedrock of the modern mind. Long before the university lecture hall, the fundamental structure of Western education was being carefully assembled within monastery walls. Monastic schools were the essential first step, initially training oblates, the children offered to the monastery in the skills necessary for their religious life, reading Latin, writing, and understanding Scripture. Yet this mission quickly expanded beyond the choir. These schools became the primary, and often the only, source of formal learning for centuries, educating the sons of nobles and even promising local boys. The curriculum they safeguarded was a profound inheritance from the classical world, the 7 liberal arts. This was divided into 2 paths. First came the trivium, the 3 ways of language, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. This was the foundation of all clear thinking and effective communication. Next was the quadrivium, the 4 paths of number, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, which explored the ordered patterns of the universe itself. This entire system was not just a collection of subjects, it was a comprehensive training program for the intellect. It taught a young mind how to parse a complex sentence, how to build a logical argument step by step, and how to spot a flaw in reasoning. These were the very tools of critical thought. When these monastic schools evolved into the great cathedral schools and then into the first universities, they carried this entire educational framework with them. The intellectual habits forged in the quiet of the cloister, the meticulous textual analysis from the Scriptorium, the disciplined focus of the scholastic disputation, all became the foundational skills for any serious scholar. This is the great, often unacknowledged legacy of monastic seclusion. The storm of the Protestant Reformation was led by men like Luther, who was a product of this very system. But look further. The later upheaval of the Enlightenment, with its fierce questioning of all authority, was also powered by minds trained in a tradition that began with the trivium and quadrivium. Philosophers who championed reason itself were standing on a foundation built by praying monks. The quest for knowledge, so patiently cultivated in silence, did not just preserve the past. It became the very engine for an endless future of change, ensuring that the quiet work of a secluded few would ultimately teach the world how to think. A vow of poverty could build a fortune. The monastery, for all its spiritual aims, was also a formidable economic engine. These communities, sworn to personal poverty, collectively amassed immense wealth through centuries of pious donations from kings and nobles seeking divine favor. A single abbey might own tens of thousands of acres of farmland, forests, and entire villages. To manage these vast estates, monks became pioneers of advanced agriculture. They cleared marshes, rotated crops, and bred superior livestock, turning once marginal lands into highly productive assets. The Cistercians, in their search for remote valleys, became unintended masters of the wool trade, their vast flocks of sheep making them major players in a booming international market. Their undyed wool became a prized commodity, sold at fairs from England to Italy, funding their austere abbeys through a deeply worldly enterprise. This created an inescapable paradox. How could an institution dedicated to renouncing the world become so enmeshed in its commerce? The very success of their secluded enterprise undermined its founding principle. The spiritual credibility of the monastic ideal rested on a foundation of simplicity and separation from material concerns. Yet here were abbots acting as landlords, bankers, and industrial managers, their decisions dictated as much by harvest yields and market prices as by the liturgical calendar. This visible wealth became a magnet for criticism, a glaring contradiction that reformers like Francis of Assisi and the spiritual descendants of Jan Hus would seize upon. They asked a devastatingly simple question: where in the Gospels did Christ command the accumulation of land and treasure? The monastic economy, for all its discipline and innovation, had created a trap of its own making. The walls designed to keep the world out could not prevent the corrosive influence of worldly success from seeping in, turning a beacon of otherworldly devotion into a monument to the very temptations it was built to escape. The stones themselves held a silent debate. A monastery's physical form was a perfect expression of its divided soul, a structure designed to turn the spirit inward while projecting an undeniable power outward. At the very center of this world lay the cloister, a square garden courtyard enclosed by graceful, covered walkways. This was the monastery's true heart, a space of profound intentionality. The covered arcades offered shelter from sun and rain, a place for the monks to walk in quiet contemplation or sit and read their sacred texts. The garden at its center was not for food, but for the soul, a symbolic representation of paradise, a controlled piece of nature meant to inspire reflection on the divine order. The cloister was literally and symbolically a barrier, a serene buffer zone that separated the monks from the chaos and temptations of the world beyond the walls. It was architecture in the service of inner focus. Yet, just a few steps away stood a structure that screamed a very different message to the landscape. The great abbey church, like the one at Cluny, was an overwhelming monument of stone and glass. Its sheer scale was staggering, with towers that scraped the sky and interiors so vast they could swallow entire towns. The walls were lined with chapels donated by nobles, the altars gleamed with gold and precious gems, and the windows glowed with stained glass that told sacred stories in a blaze of color. This was not a building designed for quiet introspection. It was a statement of immense wealth, influence, and divine favor. It was a spiritual fortress, a permanent footprint meant to awe every peasant, knight, and king who laid eyes on it. Can you feel the contradiction built into the very stone? The humble monk's cell, a small space for solitary prayer and study, existed in the shadow of a cathedral that rivaled a royal palace. The cloister garden, a space of quiet simplicity, was funded by the rents from vast estates and the profits of international trade. This architectural duality tells the story of the monastic ideal stretched to its breaking point. The community looked inward for spiritual purity within the cloister, while its church reached aggressively for the heavens, projecting an image of unshakable authority to the outside world. The tension between withdrawal and impact was not just an idea, it was carved into the arches and enclosed in the courtyards, a physical flaw in the foundation that would one day split the entire structure apart. Behind the great abbey walls, a parallel world of female devotion was flourishing. The story of monastic reform is not solely a male one, though history's spotlight has often passed over the crucial roles women played. In powerful, independent communities, they proved that spiritual and intellectual fervor could thrive under conditions of even stricter seclusion. Consider the remarkable Hildegard of Bingen. In the 12th century, she rose to become the abbess of a double monastery, a community of both nuns and monks, and she commanded an authority that would be extraordinary even today. Hildegard was a visionary in every sense, a powerhouse of creativity and intellect who corresponded with popes and emperors. She composed ethereal music that still haunts listeners, wrote profound theological texts detailing her mystical visions, and even produced groundbreaking works on natural science and medicine. Her voice, emerging from a life of vowed enclosure, demonstrates that profound influence could be wielded from within the cloister by a woman who never left her Rhineland convent. A different path was forged by Clare of Assisi. Captivated by the radical message of St. Francis, she too renounced her wealthy family to embrace a life of absolute poverty. She founded the Order of the Poor Clares, a female community dedicated to the same austere ideals as the Franciscan Friars, but with one key difference: they lived in strict enclosure. While the Friars moved through the world, the Poor Clares pursued their spiritual revolution from behind their own convent walls. Their seclusion was not a limitation, but a different kind of power, a focused intensity that made their communities into fortresses of prayer and discipline. These women, and countless others like them, were not passive participants in the age of reform. They were active architects of it, building their own spheres of influence and proving that the storm of change was sparked and sustained by dedicated minds regardless of gender. Their legacy is a quiet but forceful reminder that the deepest revolutions often have many leaders, some speaking from the public square, and others writing their wisdom from a silent cell. While theologians debated doctrine and popes wielded power, a far more intimate revolution was unfolding in the quiet of the cloister. This was the world of Christian mysticism, a tradition built on the belief that the divine could be known not just through scripture or sacrament, but through a direct, overwhelming, and personal encounter. For these seekers, the monastery cell was not a place of escape, but a launch pad into the infinite. They pursued a God who could be experienced, a presence felt so immediately it defied all words and shattered normal understanding. In 14th century Germany, the Dominican friar Meister Eckhart preached startling sermons from this profound inner knowing. He spoke of a God beyond God, a divine ground of being so abstract and limitless that it made all human concepts of the divine seem like childish toys. His language was deliberately paradoxical, designed to break the mind's habitual thinking. He urged his listeners to achieve a state of detachment, to let go of even their idea of God, in order to be united with the divine essence. To be just, he declared, a person must be justice itself. This was a theology of radical immanence, suggesting that the soul could become one with its creator, a concept that made church authorities deeply uneasy. At the very same time, in a small anchor hold attached to a church in Norwich, England, a woman named Julian was having visions of her own. Following a near-fatal illness, Julian of Norwich received a series of 16 revelations, or showings, which she spent the next 20 years contemplating in her solitary cell. Her theology was not one of fear, but of breathtaking love. In one of her most famous visions, she saw the entire universe as a small, simple thing held tenderly in God's hand. And she wrote of Christ as a compassionate mother who feeds us with his own body and loves us with an unbreakable, nurturing care. All shall be well, she famously wrote, and all manner of things shall be well. This was a message of comfort and hope that flowed directly from her personal, mystical encounters, completely bypassing the institutional channels of grace. The path of these mystics was the ultimate internal reform. It prioritized the authority of personal revelation, the truth known in the depths of one's own soul, over the external authority of any church official. Their writings, born from the deepest silence, offered a radically different way to spiritual truth, one that anyone, in theory, could access through devoted prayer and contemplation. This was a silent, personal storm that could utterly reshape a soul from within, proving that the most explosive reformation often begins not with a public protest, but in the private, luminous darkness of a seeking heart. The echo of the cloister never truly faded. Long after the last stones of the great abbeys crumbled into romantic ruins, the core ideals forged within them found a surprising new home in the secular world. The storm of reform and the later age of enlightenment did not destroy the monastic spirit. It simply scattered its seeds into the fertile soil of wider society. The modern research university is a direct and powerful heir to this legacy. Think of a professor in her laboratory or a doctoral student in the library stacks, dedicating years to a single, specialized field of inquiry. This is a secular version of the monk's lifelong devotion to study. The university campus, with its quadrangles and quiet courtyards, even mirrors the physical layout of the monastic cloister, creating a space intentionally set apart from the hustle of daily life for the singular pursuit of knowledge. The disciplined focus required for deep scholarship is the same intellectual asceticism once practiced in the Scriptorium. Similarly, the contemporary fascination with secular retreat centers and intentional communities reveals a persistent human longing for the structure monasticism provided. People today willingly withdraw to quiet places for silent meditation, yoga intensives, or writers' residencies. They are seeking, perhaps without even knowing it, a taste of the Benedictine balance of ora et labora, a structured time for reflection balanced with purposeful work, all within a supportive community. Even the concept of a vocation has been transformed. We no longer speak of it solely in religious terms. Today, we talk about finding your calling in medicine, in art, in environmental activism, or in coding. This idea that one's work can be a profound, life-defining purpose, a dedication that demands discipline and sometimes sacrifice, is a direct secular inheritance from the monastic understanding of a life vowed to a higher cause. The walls may have fallen, but the values they protected, community, discipline, contemplation, and the pursuit of truth, simply walked out the gate and blended into the modern world, shaping our deepest ideals about how to live a meaningful and focused life. Our world now spins on a digital axis, yet the ancient yearning for quiet focus has not disappeared. It has simply adapted. The modern monk no longer wears a rough wool habit, but might sport a hoodie, seeking not a desert cave but a soundproofed room where the only chant is the quiet hum of a server. This is the new seclusion, a conscious withdrawal from the endless noise of notifications and the curated perfection of social media feeds. Programmers enter states of deep flow, solving complex problems in uninterrupted silence. Academics retreat to archives or labs, their focus sharpened by turning away from digital distractions. Even the simple act of a digital detox, a weekend without screens, is a small-scale monastic retreat for the soul, an attempt to clear the mental clutter and rediscover a thread of genuine thought. This modern silence is not an escape from reality, but a strategic pause to engage with it more deeply. Just as the quiet of the cloister allowed monks to ponder scripture and philosophy, our own forms of disconnection create the mental space necessary for creativity and critical thought to flourish. The greatest challenges of our time, from climate change to artificial intelligence, demand not just quick reactions but profound reflection. The next world-changing idea might not be born in a crowded conference room, but in the quiet mind of someone who had the courage to log off. Look at the internet itself, a sprawling, chaotic, and magnificent echo of the ancient Scriptorium. It is our global library, preserving humanity's knowledge with a scale and speed those medieval scribes could never have conceived. Every uploaded research paper, every digitized manuscript, every thoughtful blog post is a form of copying and preservation, ensuring that the collective wisdom of our species is not lost. Yet this vast digital scriptorium is also a noisy marketplace of ideas, where profound insights clash with trivialities, and where the disciplined focus of the monk is more valuable than ever to discern truth from the static. This reveals a timeless pattern, a pulse that beats through history. The dynamic between silence and storm is not confined to the Middle Ages. It is a recurring human cycle. Purposeful disconnection, the voluntary embrace of quiet, consistently generates the intellectual and spiritual energy that reconnects and reforms our world in the most unexpected ways. The storm of change always gathers first in a profound and focused silence. The greatest transformations begin not with a shout, but with a listening silence. Our journey from the silent cloister to the explosive reforms of history reveals a powerful and enduring pattern, one that pulses through the centuries. Profound, world-altering change consistently germinates in environments of focused seclusion. The monastic commitment to prayer, study, and discipline was never a true retreat from the world. It was instead a strategic withdrawal that forged the very intellectual and spiritual tools used to reshape civilization itself. We saw this with the Cluniac whisper for purity that built a spiritual empire, and with the Cistercian Revolution of radical humility that swept across Europe from a desolate swamp. This quiet work culminated in the earthquake of the Protestant Reformation, a firestorm ignited by a single monk's personal terror and theological breakthrough within his own cell. In every case, the secluded life proved to be a potent catalyst for public upheaval. This history offers us a crucial lesson for our own noisy era, a reminder of the enduring value in creating space for deep reflection, for critical thought, and for principled living. These are not passive or peaceful pursuits. They are the active, generative forces that challenge institutional stagnation and ignite the necessary transformations that push humanity forward. Let this story of silence and storm inspire you to find your own moments of purposeful quiet. Protect them, cherish them, and see what grows there, for you never know what gentle, personal revolution might one day swell into a hurricane of positive change for us all. We would love to hear from you. Share in the comments what aspects of this incredible journey from silence to storm surprised you the most.